When we're talking about psychoactive plants, there's usually several categories you can plot them in if you're trying to work out what the effects are. Because people like to know what they're taking and also what it's going to do. So we like to classify them. So you have your sort of psychedelics, you have your hallucinogens and oneogens, which are the dream inducers. You have your stimulants, and you have your hypnotics and narcotics. And that little graph there on the right-hand side it's a map that I designed for trying to work out neuropharmacology. I'm a natural scientist, studied geology and paleontology and botany, not neuropharmacology. So to make neuropharmacology easy to understand for myself and actually anyone else in this room, I made a little diagram there of all the neuroreceptors. It's not scientifically accurate, but it's great for remembering how everything works. And in fact, that the explanation of that diagram was the very first EGA back at Ruby's in Belgrave. Yeah. So one of the first things is, when I'm talking about the psychoactive plants of Australasia, what is Australasia? People thinking just Australia? It's a bit more complex than that. Going up north, it includes, well, include anything sort of east of the Wallace Line. Now, Wallace was a guy, a contemporary of Charles Darwin, who was collecting butterflies and other specimens in Asia, and he worked out that there was one group of animals west of the line that he would call Asian, a very Asian fauna. And on the east of that line, it was very Australian. And there was a distinct line, and he called that the Wallace Line. In fact, Wallace also worked out the theory of evolution at the same time as Darwin, but he didn't have quite the extensive research in it that Darwin did, so that's why we call it Darwin's theory of evolution, not Wallace's theory of evolution. So we have our Australian mainland, we have New Guinea and Tasmania, which are parts of the Australian continent. Sort of, if you think about climate change, the climate has actually been getting wetter, and the sea levels have been rising from about 18,000 years ago to 6,000 years ago. 18,000 years ago, there was big ice caps over North America and Europe, and also all the water was locked in the ice caps. And then they started melting, and the sea levels rose. So Bass Strait itself didn't form till about 12,000 years ago, and Torres Strait formed about 9,500 years ago as the sea levels flooded those low-lying areas of Australia. So when I talk about Australia, I tend to also think about Tasmania and New Guinea as part of the Australian continent. Now, there are a whole lot of islands off to the southeast of New Guinea. We have the Solomons, Vanuatu, and we have the Spice Islands just to the west of New Guinea, and they're all part of the Australasian group. And then we have I also include the flora of the sunken continent of Tasmantis, which is from New Caledonia to New Zealand. Most of that continent is actually underwater. So now let's get into our actual plant stuff. For our psychedelic plants, we have the acacias, we have a whole list of plants, and we have our various fungi, which is not in today's talk, but so I'll quickly mention the fungi. We have our ergots, which are used to make LSD. We have our gold tops and blue meanies, the psilocybin fungi. And we have some odd things. This Nonda is used by the shamans in New Guinea, and they're used in sort of various rituals. Some of them are more recreational, but some of them are sacred rituals. And they use different types of mushrooms at different levels, including the psilocybes at the highest levels. So it's a pretty good indication that the New Guinean fungi, even though no one's tested these guys, are psychoactive. So let's get into our native plants. The wattles. Everyone here knows about wattles. In fact, I see quite a few people with wattles in their hands. Yeah, so a lot of these species contain DMT, and so you see these two ones in black. that means it's been published in the scientific literature. So that's knowledge that everyone can look up quite easily. All these other ones, and there's quite a lot of them, have been worked out by people in Australia, going out there and just testing. JJ, who speaks at EGA every now and again, every few years, tells us of wonderful new species of acacia he's discovered which are rich in DMT. And so this is how we expand our knowledge. So things like Acacia floribunda is quite common across Australia. And then there's a whole lot more species that are suspected to contain DMT. It's sort of, they haven't been formally verified, although I'm looking at you, Torsten, over there, but many of them have had reports of containing DMT. So here we have our map of the most common ones: Acacia maydeni, Floribunda, obtusifolia, and Acacia sophorae. So since we're all people of the East Coast, this is probably our more interesting map. And then, due to the work of JJ and others, we have a list of wattles from the western side of Australia, which isn't published in the scientific literature, but it has been presented at EGA. So we have, this is all JJ's work, and some of those are very potent. They're very strong in DMT. And so this is our map of our sort of western wattles. And as you can see, Acacia burkittii goes right across into central New South Wales, just if we've got anyone who goes out that way. Otherwise, you'd probably have to be a resident of the southwestern of WA. And then we have our wattles up from the top end, our tropical wattles. And these are also mostly from JJ, working out, finding DMT in them. And yes, they're all up here. But we also have wattles that are considered quite rare and endangered, and some of those have DMT too. In fact, Torsten was talking about one of them yesterday at his EGA presentation. Where did Torsten go? Oh, there he is, hiding away. So yes, I haven't added your one in because I didn't realise it was public knowledge until yesterday. But this Acacia flebophylla, everyone would know, the buffalo sallow wattle up on the sort of Mount Buffalo. And there we have Dennis McKenna examining the buffalo sallow wattle. Sort of. But these are all plants that are found only from one specific location. Yeah, sort of ignore the mapping software, it's actually just sort of there. And we have our other ones just there, and sort of just there, and just there, all from one individual place, so they're all quite endangered. So of course, as a community, we try and encourage people not to harvest these plants, except for, say, seeds. And JJ has also worked on some of the wattles in the South Pacific. Now, the wattles are a broad group. There is an enormous amount of wattle species, and most of those are found in Australia. And in fact, a few years ago, the wattles had to be divided into different genus names. And there was a bit of a controversy because Australia really wanted to keep the genus name Acacia for most of their species, which are actually most of the wattle species. And under the laws of scientific nomenclature, it's normally the first described species gets to keep the genus name. But in this case, Australia won out, and so most of the wattles keep their name Acacia rather than Racosperma, which it would have been. And I'm sure Rack would have been pleased with that too, by the way. Now, because Australia is the centre of acacia biodiversity, the nearby islands also have various acacia species. And some of these are rich in DMT. Now, one of them, Acacia simplex, found here in various islands, also contains odd things like 4-methyltryptamine, which we don't have any sort of trip reports or psychedelic reports. So who knows if that's active or not. And now let's get on to some of the other plants that we get in Australia. The acacias were the big one, of course, and there's still probably lots more to discover there. But some of the smaller, the bean plants, sort of Desmodium and Macana and Phyllodeum, all have sort of smaller amounts of DMT and 5-MeO DMT. And so this is their distribution. As you can probably work out from the map, they're basically tropical or desert species. So not much good for us down here, but if you're up north, sort of you can get to go bushwalking. And here's another one, the butterfly bush. Now it's a highly variable species, so with a lot of these plants you actually don't know what the concentration of interesting alkaloids is going to be. Unfortunately, that's the nature of them being wild. In wild plants, there are a whole lot of variabilities in these things. So, but it contains DMT. And now we get to another interesting DMT-containing species, the Pandanus. Up in New Guinea, it's used by the Nangamp of the Wagi region. Now they eat it and induces a madness for quite a few hours. So this is not typical of DMT to have an edible form. They eat the fruit of this particular Pandanus tree, but we do actually know, and someone did actually collect some and send it down to Melbourne to scientists back in the 60s, I think it was, or early 70s, and they tested and they found DMT in it and quite a few other alkaloids which they never got around to categorising because the sample itself was slightly decayed or was basically fungus infected. And I actually went and talked to the guy who did the analysis to find out more about this, and this is how I found out that the sample itself wasn't a particularly good one. He took the best bits he could, but this guy was the guy who discovered DMT in grasses. Okay, now there's a condition called sheep staggers, and so Australia riding on the back of the sheep for its economic growth. Yeah. Anyway, it was a bit concerned, so they did lots of tests and found out that all these grasses they'd introduced into the pasture for the sheep and cattle, they are rich sources of DMT and 5-MeO DMT and bufotenine and gramine and a whole host of other tryptamine alkaloids, and also, in fact, quite a lot of alkaloids. And the trouble with these is they're highly variable. They change their alkaloid content over the day. So usually, if you were trying to examine, say, for DMT, you'd have to go out in the morning as the best time to collect for looking at DMT profiles in these grasses. Now all these grasses are all introduced. So normally I wouldn't concern myself with this in my talk, but one, it was discovered in Australia, and two, they do actually have a relative, Phragmites australis, a common reed, that also has DMT in its rhizome. Only in tiny amounts, but it's there. So yeah, pasture grasses sort of spread all around southeastern Australia and southwestern WA, where humans and their cattle go, basically. Now, in New Caledonia, they have a lot of interesting ancient plants there, and these plants, the Hugonia, have 5-MeO DMT. Now, if anyone's got any good ideas, I've called these plants Boetes plants because they contain ibogaine and other iboga-type alkaloids. So basically, the iboga plant is worshipped by the Boete of Africa, so I've just called them Boetes plants. But there's two of them, Tabernae montana orientalis and Pandakii, that contain sort of ibogaine or related alkaloids. They're nowhere near the strength of iboga. Iboga would still be the best source of ibogaine. And there was quite a few talks yesterday about ibogaine and its sort of use in abating heroin addiction and such. So yes, they're tropical plants. So if you live up north, you're in lots of luck. And now we come to the morning glories, famous for their seeds that contain LSA and similar compounds. Now, one of the richest sources of these compounds is from this, we call it actually the silver morning glory, although in America they call it Hawaiian baby wood rose. Now, it's not actually native to Hawaii, it's native from India across to Australia. So getting puzzled looks there. Yeah, that's actually true. They imported into Hawaii for the basically the flower industry, and it's a very rich source of these ergot alkaloids. And we have a whole group of sort of morning glory species, mostly in the middle of Australia. This one has the lovely common name of poison morning glory. Because sort of cattle tend to eat it and then sort of wander around staggering. So that sort of is an indication of, it's interesting. And then we have our other related plants. Now, the interesting thing here is everyone here would know about the sort of ergot alkaloids from ergot. I would assume so. It's sort of where we get our LSD from. Now, what people did in experiments was they treated the seeds of these plants, or particular couple of species, with a fungicide, and then grew the plants, and then they tested the seeds of those, and there were no ergot alkaloids. This was actually done on overseas ones, but it seems that there's endogenous ergot relatives growing with these plants that's producing the alkaloids. And that produces a protective effect on the plants against being eaten. So it sort of formed a symbiosis. So it's not the plants themselves that are producing the ergot alkaloids, it's a fungus growing within the plant. But if you just collect the seeds, we stand the benefit. And yes, like I said earlier, if you live up in the northern end of Australia, you're the lucky ones. And this blue one is the one I was saying, its common name was the poison morning glory. So not fun, or perhaps too much fun if you're a cattle. And now we get into a slightly different category. Now the psychedelics, they all affected the serotonin receptor. These guys generally affect other receptors. Now we have our, this is one from New Guinea, or it's actually also found in Northern Australia. The bark and leaves are eaten by the natives of New Guinea, and it's reported to induce visions in a dreamlike state. And it has over 20 alkaloids, and they work similar to the Datura alkaloids, slightly different. There was a EGA presentation in one of the outdoor events quite a few years ago, where a person, one of the scientists, brought along bark from this tree, and it does have quite a powerful effect. I had quite a bit of trouble standing up from my seat after chewing a bit of that. And in Australia, it's those guys up in the tropics that are having all the fun. So I'm looking at you, Torsten, over there, wherever you are. Now, those are the Aboriginal names for what we call sort of Datura leichhartii and sort of Duboisia myoporoides. Now, there's 4 Duboisia species in Australia, and you see 3 of them here, and there's a good reason for that. These 2 are very rich sources of scopolamine type alkaloids, so rich that they were grown during the Second World War for travel sickness tablets for the rest of the Allies, some of the richest sources of alkaloids in the world. And they still have farms of these guys for that purpose. And it turns out if you're a mistletoe and you're growing on, well, in this particular case, on Duboisia myoporoides, you also pick up the alkaloids. Not quite as strong, but I suppose if you're a druid, this is an extra bonus. True hallucinogenic mistletoe. Now, this one here, there's not much reported Aboriginal usage, but there is a report that the young men would used to drill holes in the tree, pour water in, and then later that day, or the next day, drink the water and go into a sort of staggers or a stupor, so basically get drunk. Now, look, no one's actually tested it, but there's either two ways. Pouring water, if there was water, it could ferment if there's sugar in the tree, or it's picking up the alkaloids and they're basically getting intoxicated off that. But there's only that one report, and it was sort of one of the early explorers. So it's probably not a sacred plant to the Aborigines, but it's more like that was sort of something the young men used to do. And this is our Datura. There's a debate amongst botanists whether it's a native species or not, because there are some people who believe that Daturas only come from the Americas. And the trouble with this one, though, it was discovered in Australia by explorers long before it was discovered in the Americas. So it's one of those things. Is it Australian? Is it American? It's one of those things that botanists like to debate about. And this is our myoporoides, and this is our inland corkwood. And there's just one little spot here for the Arantensis, which is a fairly weak one. Its alkaloid content is much, much smaller than the other two, so it was only discovered a couple of decades ago. Now, we also have a whole lot of flowers, a whole lot of plants and shrubs in the Solanaceae that have these alkaloids. They're basically too many to sort of talk about as much, but basically some of them also have nicotine in them. They're generally fairly poor, but the ones in black have alkaloid contents greater than 0.1%, although these alkaloids are quite powerful. And so generally they're in South Australia, Western Victoria and WA. Now, nutmeg. Everyone here would know about nutmeg and how it's a reported hallucinogen, how you can the old reports, how you can trip on nutmeg. Well, it's basically due to its oil content. It's not alkaloids, it's the oil. So we have some myristicin, safrole, and also elemicin and methyl-eugenol. Now these oils are interesting in that they're the oils that you need to make MDMA and related compounds. Everyone would probably have cottoned onto that with Torsten's talk yesterday about growing plants for saffron, for the need of safrole for industry. And these other oils are related to safrole and produce similar compounds if they're treated much the same way. Now, nutmeg itself grows in the Spice Islands, which is sort of east of the Wallace Line, so it's part of the Australasia flora. And there are other species that grow in New Guinea. So Papua nutmeg is supposed to have sedative properties, unlike the sort of herbal nutmeg or the culinary nutmeg. There's also a nutmeg in Australia, but that doesn't seem to have any interesting oils. In fact, its scientific name is insipida, because it's rather insipid. But there is another plant that has an oil profile similar to nutmeg, and that is the kava of the Maori, Macropipa excelsum. It has myristicin and elemicin in similar similar ratios to nutmeg. And when the Maori got there, they called this plant kava, and they ended up using it in religious ceremonies. But it doesn't have the kava lactones that the South Pacific kava does. It has properties similar to nutmeg. And while we're talking about oils, our carrots and pepper bush, they have sort of saffrol and myristicin and various other oils. But these ones contain myristicin, which seems to be the main active oil of nutmeg. Now, here's a plant from Southeast Asia and New Guinea that's reputed to have slight visionary properties, or a dream inducer at least, and that's galangal. Now, it's used by at least one tribe in New Guinea as a hallucinogen, but others as a dream inducer. However, most of it would probably just find it in our spice cabinet, especially if you go to some of the Vietnamese spice shops down in Springvale. Now, these guys, the caltrops, have sort of hamala alkaloids, harmine and harmol. The main interest for the hamala alkaloids is, of course, to make ayahuasca. Although these guys wouldn't be anywhere near as good, or at least that one, say, as Vine of the Soul. But there are other sort of plants in this species, plants in this genera, other species, that the Aborigines used that have medicinal qualities. What's in them has never been, the work hasn't been done, but one of them that was used to stun fish, they'd throw the bark into the water and the fish would come up and there would be your dinner. Another one, they used to treat toothache with that. So whether these guys have hamala alkaloids, we don't know, but it's one of those things that's worth following up one day. Now we get onto our stimulants. This is the most famous stimulant from Australia, pituri. In fact, I've got a whole talk based just on pituri because of its relevance to the Aborigines. Now, this plant is found across Central Australia. That's its broad range there. But it's only the plants from one particular spot down here that they would call pituri. In fact, they would collect these plants, they would sort of dry them in their special way, and then they'll trade them across large areas along these trade routes. And the reason why is that they have high levels of nicotine and very high levels. So we're talking about 5% alkaloids, of which nearly all is nicotine. And in fact, there's one early report of a person who lived in outback Queensland that the Aborigines used it as basically as a visionary plant, which nicotine can do in high enough levels. So in South America, we see people blowing or sort of taking on enormous cigars to enter the underworld, to go into their sort of sacred sort of estates. But generally it was used as a stimulant and also as a friendship. So they'd trade it across large parts of Australia. By the end of the trade routes, you'd be trading a bag of pituri for a couple of women. And yes, there was a couple of women for a bag of pituri. And it turns out Australia also has quite a range of native tobaccos. Many of these were used by the Aborigines as sort of going down in their order of preference. And it's basically, though, to do with Central Australia. Where there was pituri trade, where there was pituri knowledge, they would also use native tobacco as a stopgap or a filler. So there are some native tobaccos outside of the sort of pituri trade range, outside the pituri knowledge, and they can be just as potent, but they weren't used by the Aborigines. There's one down near Geelong, up in the Uyangs, that sort of work was done at Monashuni, and it was found just to be strong as some of these other ones, but there's no knowledge of indigenous usage. So the Aborigines would harvest them, and these are the ones that are important to the Aborigines. So generally, where the pituri would be traded, there you'd find native tobacco to be grown. Now, another stimulant are the bluebells. the isotomas and lobelias and pratias. These guys were also used in times of tobacco shortage, or in fact even in preference to some of those weak tobacco, some of the ones down lower on the list. And there's at least one that hasn't been tested that was also used by Aborigines. And these guys are rich in the lobelia alkaloids, which is a stimulant with similar properties to nicotine. And as you can see, they're found wide-ranging across Australia. Now here's one from Southeast Asia, but also from New Guinea. It's betel nut, where the alkaloid is arecoline. Now this is our betel nut tree, and in Southeast Asia they like to chew it. They mix it up with a leaf of a piper plant they call the betel, and sort of they cut up the betel nut, they put it with a bit of lime, and they chew it, and it's a stimulant. And there are various other plants sort of in this genus that are used in New Guinea as sort of substitutes for betel nut when betel nut is not around. And there's even other related plants, a bit further related, that are used as well. In fact, Torsten gave a talk on one of those yesterday. Where did that Torsten go to? Yeah. There he is. Yes. So that's one that I'll actually have to add in for future of this talk, because he actually found arecoline in that. About, was it 30% less than betel nut itself, but still quite reasonable? Yeah, I'll get a nod there. Now, in Taiwan, there's actually a market for betel nut girls, so scantily clad girls who sell betel nut to passing motorists by the side of the road. Sort of like cigarette girls of many a year ago. But yeah, so there's sort of competition to sell the most betel nut and to wear the skimpiest clothing to get the most customers. Now, here we are with acacia again, but this time it's not in our psychedelic side of things. It's because the swamp wattle contains nicotine. So now there are also reports, and these have never been replicated, but a lab in America found amphetamine and methamphetamine in tiny amounts in a couple of acacia species. And since it's never been replicated, people think that this could be contamination. That's a possibility, or it could be acacias are just more bizarre than we thought. It's worth reporting just because that those plants also had been reported to contain nicotine, and acacias do contain nicotine as well. But since they're not native acacias, it's just a throwaway line. Now this is tar. Tar is sort of our relatives of coca, Orthoxylum. We have native Orthoxylum species up in the tropics, and they're used by the natives of New Guinea who chew the leaves as a stimulant. In Malaysia, they use a slightly different species as a tonic, which basically means a pick-me-up. And they contain tropococaine. And now, tropococaine is, I have at least one book by a guy called Otto Snow called THC and Tropococaine, where he talks about tropococaine being preferable to cocaine because it didn't have the sort of heart effects that cocaine does. Seems a bit odd to me, since cocaine seems to be so prevalent in the market rather than tropococaine. That's one of the things about capitalism, it lets the market decide. And so these ones that contain tropococaine are in the backwaters of New Guinea and Southeast Asia. And there's also one in New Caledonia that at least hasn't been tested, but it's also used as a tonic. Now, these are Aboriginal stimulants. These plants, Clerodendrum, they'll use the stems and crush them, soak them with water. Sometimes they'll chewed with ashes for the lime, and lime releases the alkaloids. And they're basically used as a stimulant. What's in them, or if they're active at all, really, unknown. And same here with Goodenia. it's also another plant that's used in preference to the weaker tobacco, so it implies that there's interesting alkaloids in there. They're used by some of the tribes in Central Australia as a stimulant. Okay, now this is a plant that's going to be more interesting than the sort of caltrops. These were used as tobacco substitutes. Basically, we know that their relatives contain beta-carbolines. So if I was going to look for an ayahuasca analog, or to try and replace the vinyl sol with native plants, I'd be looking at the gruias. They were basically, don't know much about that particular species that was used by the Aborigines, but like I said, the genus itself is known to contain small amounts of beta-carbolines. And this is our map of the various Aboriginal stimulants. So yes, very heavily weighted towards the central and northern Australia, because that's where Aboriginal culture is strongest and where we've got more ethnobotanical knowledge, because they survived with their knowledge. Now here's one from an old explorer's report, the Currajong. It's Brachychiton, and it's reported to contain caffeine. I don't know who got analysed it, but he said that this tree, the seeds contain caffeine. It's from sort of the start of the 20th century. So if you're looking for your a bush tucker equivalent for coffee, this would be the plant to go. And the seeds were eaten by the Aborigines. And it's quite possible that it contains caffeine because it's in the same family as coffee. And this is another little plant. It's used to treat, well, some of them are used to treat dysentery. Basically, they contain ephedrine. Of course, ephedrine being a rather sort of banned alkaloid because it's used to make speed. But in these cider plants, yeah, these are also sources of ephedrine. And as I was saying before, yes, if you're up in the northern Australia, you're all the lucky ones. Now this is an unusual one. This is toot, also known as tutu. The Maori made a drink that they consider refreshing but intoxicating from the berries. Now the honey from this also has intoxicating qualities, and the trouble with this plant though is it's actually quite poisonous. If cattle get into a patch of New Zealand bush that's got tutu in it, they will die of convulsions. And what's in here is a compound called tutin, and it's a GABA antagonist. So that means it works at the opposite way to, say, GABA and GHB in your sort of Valium and benzodiazepines and such. It sort of blocks GABA from working. So tiny amounts would be a stimulant. And now we have our hypnotics and narcotics. We have our kava. That's our kava hall here. And quite often it was the young maidens of the tribe who would prepare the kava for the men to drink, especially the senior men, the elders and the chiefs, and visitors and such. And so if you can tell, I didn't update it, but I've still got this listed as Piper witchmanii, rather than now Piper methysticum variety witchmanii, which I talked about this yesterday, just on this particular plant. It's found sort of across the South Pacific in sort of Melanesia, a tiny bit of Micronesia and Polynesia. It's ritually it's drunk as a like a tea in a ritual setting for sort of greeting friends, saying goodbye to honoured guests. Actually, any good reason would be a reason for drinking kava. Now, the term for having a bit too much is called crunked, which is quite an amusing term, and it has the compounds in it carbolactones, sort of the alpha pyrrons, and they're found in the root. Actually, they're found in other parts of the plant too, and that turned out to be a bit of a disaster. at the start of the 21st century, when companies started harvesting the aerial parts of the plant and making kava pills for that for sale in Germany and other parts of Europe. And it turned out the aerial plants plus ethanol extraction was a bad combination, because you're getting other compounds in there that are basically cause liver disease, liver damage, even occasionally killing people from the damage it did to the liver. So the traditional way with kava is the best. And this is the shell ginger from the Moluccas of Indonesia, and it contains one of the sort of kava lactones, or one of the lesser sort of desired, but it's in there. And here we have our water lilies. As you can tell from our retailers sort of down the back there, who sell the blue water lily, there's actually some interesting effects there. It's rather hypnotic, a hypnotic euphoric effect, and when mixed with wine. It was Torsten, I believe, who taught me about making sure you mix it with wine. But I believe it's also active when smoked. And basically, this is an interesting one to look at, because most of the Australian lotuses haven't been tested. I don't know anyone who's going out there and checking out all of our native lotus species to see if they have similar effects to the blue lotus. And did I say before that if you're living up in northern Australia, you're the lucky ones for access to these plants? Now, this is one that I found on the internet a few years ago. It caught my curiosity. Sort of places in America selling rock blooms, basically lichen, for their effects. One of them, I Am Shaman, it sells as a legal high, especially with morning glory seeds. What's in there? Unknown. Might even be nothing there, but they're making money off selling it. And it's found in the highlands of New Guinea as well as other parts of the world. Now here we have a liverwort. Now, not many people know about their liverworts. They live in those cold, wet places, or even warm, wet places of the world, sort of under waterfalls and such. There's one found in New Zealand and Tasmania that contains a cannabinoid. There are a couple of other plants besides cannabis that contain cannabinoids, and this is one that people refer to. It contains parototinine, although I think Martin might correct my pronunciation of that. I think I butchered that. But the effects are supposed to be similar to THC, but nowhere near as potent, and the plant itself only contains small amounts of this alkaloid because it's never been bred for it. But there are reports of people collecting this in New Zealand, drying it, and smoking it with cut up Maori kava, and having a powerful effect. And no one has yet worked out the mapping software for Discover Life, the sort of why they map Tasmania over there. But anyway, that's life. And here we have another interesting plant, kratom, found in Southeast Asia, down into New Guinea, with vague reports, and very, very vague reports of up in northern Cape York. I actually had a big argument with Torsten about this, because he didn't believe it was found in New Guinea until I actually got him the papers and sent them up to him. But it's because it's well known for use in Thailand as basically to get off opium. The main alkaloid is mitragynine. It's actually works at the opioid receptor, and the leaves are either chewed or smoked. And this is Christian Rach busily planting a specimen. And I've got Torsten's name there, so I have to thank him for that photo. Now, these are odd ones are just reports from ethnobotany, or people reporting that, hey, the Aborigines used this plant as a narcotic. They used to chew the roots or leaves of the desert poplar. What's in there? Unknown. Much the same here. The bitter quandong, the root bark, was drunk by the Aborigines of Lake Bolac in northern Victoria as a narcotic. Now, it turns out the root bark extract does actually increase the pain threshold when you're testing pain in mice. So I don't know if much further work has been done on that. But here's our map of where they're found. And one of the most, yes, I see Ronnie at the back pointing out, there's a photo of Torsen there. This is one of our field trips. Now, there are a lot of people actually using Australian native plants or New Zealand native plants to make mead or beer, wine, and also spirits and liqueurs. Yep, I've been told time to wind up, which is okay. This is towards the end. So the roots of the cabbage tree we used to make alcohol. In fact, it was a escaped convict who fled to Hawaii who taught them how to make alcohol, and then the Hawaiians then taught it to the Tahitians. So this is Stone Age still, basically Stone Age technology to make a still. You can use coconut to make arak, which is a sort of spirit, and that's a picture of Indians making arak. Rum. Not many people realise that sugarcane is a native plant. Sugarcane was basically cultivated in New Guinea way back about 10,000 years ago, and its use then spread to Southeast Asia, and from Southeast Asia to India. From India it was taken by Alexander the Great to the Mediterranean region. The Portuguese and Spanish took it to the New World, and the British took it from the New World back to the continent of Australia. Sort of a full circle type of thing. But it's basically, yeah, you ferment the juice. But I'll finish up on this slide on the historical significance of rum in Australia. Australian Night, not many people know about Australian Night because it's not taught in high school history. You have to read other history books, but basically it's the 6th of February when they actually allowed all the women off the women convict ships and also all the rum was disembarked and unloaded. And the British officers were quite shocked by what occurred when all the convicts started getting into the rum. It was quite a bacchanalian orgy occurring, and that's the founding of Australia, basically with a big bang. Yes. And Ralph Clark's quote is, "Good God, what a scene of whoredom is going on there in the women's camp. I would call it by the name of Sodom, for there is more sin committed in it than any other part of the world." Now, it's a debate amongst historians sort of how much was consensual and how much was non-consensual with male convicts up on rum, but also female convicts also allowed rum. And remember, these women had been locked away on the ships for about a year, travelling from England to Australia. And women can be just as horny as men. And after a year without male contact, except for the occasional sailor who snuck down and then got whipped for creeping into the women's section of the convict ships. Some of them some of this activity would be consensual, and some of it would be non-consensual, and sort of no one's really sure. But it was fueled by rum. But rum also had Australia's first rebellion, or actually technically it might have been the second rebellion, because there was a small Irish rebellion that got quashed by the soldiers at that time, the Rum Corps. And anyway, in 1806, Governor Bligh had a dispute with MacArthur, and basically rum was being used as a currency. And so in 1807, MacArthur got the soldiers, the Rum Corps, to arrest Bligh, and basically Australia mutinied under Bligh. Poor old Bligh could never get a chance. Everyone tended to mutiny under him. And so Bligh was sent back to England, and sort of eventually we got a sort of a much better system. And okay, thank you.